Well, yesterday it was the time to check our weekly update on the raid. So now, exactly 1 week later, it's also time to check our weekly update for Mythic Plus. We left each other last week on Monday talking about Mythic Plus in week 2 during our entangling week of Fortified. Now we have week 3 with Tyrannical, Spiteful and Incorporeal, our second new affix of the season after entangling, so now all that is left is Afflicted. So in short, let's take a look at how each of the roles and the specs have been doing up to the 3rd week of this new season, starting as usual with the tanks. Now, the tanks have what I could say a positive change. Look at that from last week. We see a whopping 2% loss of Protection Paladin. We might be fearing Protection Paladin reaching 50% of all tanks in high keys. Instead, this week it has gone down slightly. Now, what is also interesting, perhaps this is where we start entering Hopium Overdose, is that the tank that grew the most in this last week was Guardian Druid, growing by almost 20% compared to week 2. They are still, despite the growth, so congrats for Guardian for growing, but they are still the least of the played tanks in high keys. We continue to have Blood Death Knight in 2nd place, and then a healthy divide between Brewmaster Monk and Vengeance Demon Hunter. But as I often say whenever we look at tanks and healers, if you have these specs above, close to or above 10% total players in high keys, it's healthy enough. It's viable enough. So here, as you can see, we have almost all of the tanks close to or above 10%. So it's not that bad of a situation, even though we see the gross 45% representation of Prot Paladin. What is also somewhat interesting is that looking at the highest of keys, so we're talking about the very, very high keys past 20, so at this moment in week 3 we are in the 23 to 25 range, 25s being the easiest of the dungeons. At the moment those are mostly underrot keys, but even then you can start seeing, for example, that you can see quite a good amount of other specs in the representation, including particularly Vengeance Demon Hunter. You know, the number of Vengeance should be 10%, but in here, for example, the number of Vengeance Demon Hunters in the highest of keys, it is closer to 25% of Vengeance Demon Hunters. This might, we're not sure, but it might have to do with the discovery that Vengeance Demon Hunter actually has amongst the, or maybe even the most damage out of all tanks right now. Especially after Brewmaster Monks have gotten their Weapons of Order hotfixed. Now Weapons of Order no longer scales damage with non-spec specific damage effects. So trinkets, rings, weapon enchantments, embellishments no longer scale with Weapons of Order, making Brewmaster Monk lose quite a bit of damage. Vengeance at the moment is quite high, and in their highest peaks it's actually higher damage than Prot Paladin. That's perhaps maybe why we are seeing Vengeance grow a little bit more recently in this season 2. Now, the next point is healers. We do have something similar like we saw with Prot Paladin losing slightly in popularity over the course of a week. We have the same thing with Resto Shaman being slightly smaller. They are still, of course, in clear first compared to all of the other healers, with Resto Druid in clear second, and then Preservation Evoker barely third above Discipline Priest. Once again though, just like I said for tanks, when you are about 10% representation as a healer, it's a pretty healthy situation for you. So here we have all of the healer specs except for Mistweaver Monk, who are all above 10% representation. So it's still quite a decent situation for healers. Just like we mentioned tanks though, when you look at high keys, the highest of keys, for example, Resto Shaman, who is supposedly 25% of all of the healers in top keys, it's actually barely in 10% of all of the keys in the highest level. When we go down to the second round, the top 20 to 40 highest keys, there is about 20% of Resto Shamans. And in the 40 to 60 top keys, right now we have 15% of Resto Shamans. What grows instead of Resto Shaman is Paladin. Holy Paladin is quite highly represented in the highest level of keys compared to what their normal representation would suggest. Meanwhile, who is heavily underrepresented compared to their overall number is Holy Priest. Holy Priest's number should be similar to Discipline and similar to Holy Paladin, but actually we have to scroll down all the way down to the 334th highest key to find the first Holy Priest in the records. Meow. So yes, overall, they are quite healthy, above 10%, very close to Discipline, very close to Holy Paladin, even somewhat close to Preservation Evoker, but not nearly as much once the keys start getting quite high in level. Moving on to the melee DPS, we have actually the opposite. We just pointed out how Prot Paladin slightly lost in popularity in this week, that Resto Shaman also slightly lost in popularity this week. For Ret, it's the opposite. Ret is actually going up this week, even more so in popularity. Very few / no changes for the other specs in terms of how popular they are in Mythic Plus. However, much like we talked about for tanks and healers, when you are talking about the highest of keys, the best groups right now trying to push the highest level of keys, for example, despite having a 25% representation, Ret Paladin is definitely not nearly as present. Ret Paladin is, for example, commonly outdone in Mythic Plus by Enhancement Shaman and by Subtlety Rogue and even by Fury Warrior, and somewhat tied to Havoc Demon Hunter when we are talking about the highest level of keys. It is not something we see that often, to see a spec so popular in keys at the 20+ level, but then see them not nearly or remotely as popular as the key goes into the 23 or 24 level. It's a significant drop compared to the other specs and the other roles. Talking about roles, the last of the roles is the ranged DPS. One of the changes for this week is that now Beast Mastery Hunter is much closer to Marksmanship Hunter in terms of popularity in this range of keys. The other specs, we continue to have Shadow Priest as the most popular, with Destruction Warlock following right after, and an uneven / balanced state of Frost Mage, Balanced Druid and Devastation Evoker coming right after. This is one of the few DPS specs which remains as popular as expected once we look at the highest keys. I'm talking about Shadow Priest. They do remain, in fact they overdo themselves because they are in 18% of keys higher than 20, but when we look at the highest keys done at the moment, their representation is closer to 80 to 85% of all of the top keys having a Shadow Priest. Meanwhile, for the majority of the other range specs, the number might be actually much lower, and that's because at the moment the meta choice for many of the groups is to go with just one range DPS. So obviously the melee DPS will have two choices, will have two picks to go for, so you can make room for one Havoc plus one Enhancement plus one Subtlety. Meanwhile, for the ranged, very often it's just one pick. So it's much more likely that they will default to picking the most popular of the ranged, which in this case is Shadow Priest. Now, this is how the situation has evolved since the start of the season. Starting with tanks, we do see, perhaps not that surprisingly, the gap we have, the gap between the bottom two being Prot Warrior and Guardian Druid, and the slightly growing gap we have at the top with Paladin being currently the first and remaining the first spec for tanks in this season, with, as we noticed before, Brewmaster and Blood Death Knight being quite close to each other. For healers, the other thing worth checking out is again the gap between the bottom two being Holy Priest and Mistweaver Monk, with the top one being Shaman, and then you have the trio in the second place. In the second tier of healers, you have Discipline, Holy Paladin and Preservation Evoker, all quite close to each other. What is interesting in this is that we just checked the healers and we saw that Resto Druid was the second most popular healer in 20+ key levels. Yet in terms of performance and in terms of keys completed at high level, it doesn't seem to be nearly as high up as what their popularity might suggest. The only reasonable change in the melee DPS is that Frost Death Knight has now removed the gap. We talked about a gap at the bottom for tanks and a gap at the bottom for healers. The gap at the bottom has been taken away by Frost DK, which is now Still bad, still below average, below the half of melee DPS, but not nearly as bad as they're close to the start of the season. Meanwhile, there is still one gap though, there is still the gap at the top with Subtlety Rogue, remaining and chilling as the most efficient and also most broad melee DPS in the highest level of keys as well. We can't, however, escape the gap when it comes to the range DPS, because at the bottom you have Beast Mastery and Affliction Warlock being quite far down the rest of the DPS. Talking about the top instead, we have an interesting situation. As you can see, towards the start of the season, Arcane Mage was actually at the top overall for quite a while, until it slowly lost a little bit compared to both Shadow Priest and Balance Druid. At the moment now you have Arcane and Frost Mage, both being very high up. No other major changes when it comes to the rest of the middle of the pack, with the exception of Frost Mage, which also went rising up over time. However, still worth mentioning that once again, at this point this is almost tradition, despite Arcane Mage starting out as the best spec and then lowering down itself to third, and then Frost Mage rising up quite a bit, once you look at the highest of keys, the most broad of the mage specs in the highest of keys is actually still Fire, regardless of how good Arcane or Frost are doing right now. In the top 100 of highest keys, you have 41 mages and 55%, basically 23 of them, are Fire mages, despite Fire Mage right now being basically half as popular overall than Frost Mage. Meanwhile, to close the situation when it comes to dungeons has remained roughly the same. At this point, most players might have gotten that the easiest and most doable dungeons, both in Fortified and Tyrannical, because at this point, from last week to this week, we still have the same top 3, regardless of the change from Fortified to Tyrannical, and those are Underrot, Freehold, and Brackenhide Hollow. Those 3 remain at the top regardless of the week. Also, there is one dungeon which remains at the bottom regardless of the week, which is Neltharus. Together, we can say, together with Vortex Pinnacle as well, being the hard one regardless of the week. So, as I said, if I had 2 cents to bet on some of the next dungeons being hotfixed with some nerfs, my bet would be specifically on Vortex Pinnacle and Neltharus. So this is what we have for this end of the 3rd reset of Season 2. So by this point, I don't want to say all, because I don't want to trigger some of you, but many players at this point have gotten their 4-piece set bonus, so we do start to see close to the max power level of many of these specs. So we're starting to see closer to the full picture of the power of the specs, and that's how we find ourselves in this week. So for today, we can stop here on our recap of the 3rd week of Mythic Plus. We are saying all of our goodbyes, starting by thanking the Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help for the growth of the channel. You can still, as usual, support completely for free. You can like and comment down below, as well as subscribe to the channel itself, together with following me over on Twitter, as well as following me over on my stream on Twitch. So with these useless things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, for a second I was doomed. I was about to close this recording and I thought the microphone was disabled and didn't record anything. Luckily it's not, so you will be able to hear all of this I just said.